In one of the key documents that's still redacted, unbelievably in my view, is a memo that Arthur Schlesinger wrote to JFK after the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy was very disillusioned with the CIA. He felt they were trying to dictate policy to him. And he talked about reorganizing the CIA. In the words that are often quoted, breaking up the CIA and scattering it to the winds, right? So this was actually a concrete expression of that impulse. We need to do something about an agency that's out of control. Arthur Schlesinger writes up his thoughts. He's got a security clearance, does a very careful study of CIA operations. In that memo to Kennedy, there is still almost an entire page redacted, okay? So the CIA is censoring criticism of itself by the White House. And we're not allowed to see that 61 years later. So Schlesinger's memo, it's not about the events that happened in Dallas. It's about the alienation of Kennedy and the CIA. That's a very basic test. If we don't get that document, the whole thing's a joke. Okay? It's that simple.
But is it legal to criticize the CIA still?
Well, that's what this document, it raises the question, right? If somebody knows the contents of that censored page and came to me and said, Jeff, I'll tell you what's in there, under the law right now, they would be taking a certain legal risk. That's a fact. And, when a JFK whistleblower approached me a couple of years ago, and I wrote about this on JFK Facts last year, he described to me a secret CIA facility in Northern Virginia where he had worked as a contractor. And he said, there's a JFK archive in there. He had seen it. He had talked to the woman who ran it, who controlled access to it. He saw what was on the shelves there. Let me mention another JFK document that's very important and I think will interest you. One of the things that's withheld and is in the JFK collection right now is the testimony of James Angleton in 1975 to the Church Committee about the Israeli nuclear program. This is a 113-page document, and it's heavily redacted to this day. And the redactions clearly pertain to Israel. Now, is this an assassination-related document? Absolutely. The Assassination Records Review Board said this is an assassination-related document. It meets the statutory definition. Okay? If the president and this effort are serious, that testimony will be declassified because Angleton controlled the Oswald file on the one hand, and he was a contact with the Israelis on the other. So it belongs in the public record. That's another test of, is this serious effort?
So let me ask you, why in the world would the Dimona project, the Israeli nuclear program, which has never officially been admitted by anybody but Israel, what would that conceivably have to do with the assassination of JFK?
Well, it relates to what Angleton was doing in 1963, okay? There were profound conflicts between Israel and the Kennedy White House over the nuclear program. Kennedy was pressing for on-site inspections, which the Israelis resisted because on-site inspections would have realized that they had a bomb-making program. So this was a real bone of contention between the Israeli government and the Kennedy administration in the summer of 1963, at a time when Angleton controlled the Oswald file. So just the juxtaposition of those facts means that everything about it should be on the public record.
And Angleton, who was the counter-intel chief at CIA, James Jesus Angleton, he... That's quite amazing. Did he support, do you know his view of the Israeli nuclear program?
I mean, it's very hard to tell sometimes from this testimony, given all the redactions. But yeah, that's, was he secretly supporting Israel against JFK? That's one of the questions that needs to be answered by full disclosure.
Lyndon Johnson did that on purpose. Wow, that's super, super dark.
And a lot of other dirty things.
And a lot of other dirty things. So the most famous dirty thing, of course, that he did was participate in some way, it's still not clear, in the murder of the president.
Right, JFK.
And you really see this in maybe the third volume of the Caro series, the biographical series on Lyndon Johnson.
Robert Caro.
I beg your pardon. Robert Caro has written this
series
of books, and Robert Caro was, I think too sympathetic, et cetera, but and very liberal and all that. But in the portion where Johnson is on the plane in Dallas and learns that Kennedy has been murdered and then is sworn in on the plane as president, it's really clear from Caro's description that this is not a surprise to him.
Not a surprise at all. And you can go down so many corridors of this. And it's not just as simple as Lyndon Johnson, was somehow involved with using his own hitman that he'd used previously.
Right.
It's not as just, that's it. That's the story, right? I've read so many books on this, and you pull the threads. How is was it Jack Rubenstein? How is he there that afternoon? How is Lyndon Johnson tied to this with a hitman? How is the mob tied to this? Like all of these strings converging. It's remarkable. And then can I just say this? I know it's crazy to talk about, but there were people like Billy Meyer who predicted this and prophesized this years in advance and knew the dates, knew the locations where he would be killed. Yeah. And also knew the dates and locations of where RFK would be assassinated.
Hale Boggs, who stood up in Congress, he was this majority leader in about 1970. He was on the Warren Commission, and he did not buy the conclusions at all. And he told other people that. He was from Louisiana, and he stood up and made some noises about on the floor of the House about how the CIA was, doing things they were not supposed to do in domestic politics and had unchecked power, et cetera. And he was immediately denounced as mentally ill, probably an alcoholic. And then he disappeared in a plane crash with Begich in 1972 in Alaska. The plane was never seen again. So, I'm not saying that he was murdered for that, though. I would not at all be surprised if he was.
The role of intelligence agencies in saving lives and in preventing conflict and attacks, I think they are actually far more valuable in that than many people realize, because they have so sullied their name by getting into all kinds of other business that they shouldn't be doing. But there is a very valuable role for them. And in that, there are some things that do, need to remain secret. But 20 years later, 40 years later, 60 years later, that then it becomes about, quote unquote, preserving trust in our institutions, right?
Continuing to lie to you.
Code for, if you knew what we did then, you would shut us down now, And
I assume that's the motive behind continuing to classify documents from 1963 in the Kennedy assassination.
Well, it's sure not sources and methods, right? I mean, if it is, then, we need
to update our sources and methods.
We need to update our sources and methods. But it's not. I mean, from time to time, they will say this is about protecting allies. Of course, I think we would all want to know if there were allies or any other nation states involved in what happened in the 60s or what happened in 9/11. So protecting anyone above the American people who you work for doesn't really make a lot of sense.
They'll actually say it's to protect allies.
Well, not about a specific operation, but as a reason for long-term classification when pushed, yeah.
That's pretty outrageous that they would admit that.
I mean,
so the interests of a foreign country are more important than the interests of the American people?
I think their kind of argument would be, if I were to steelman it, eventually the American people will be protected by something that we need from that ally, some kind of, security collaboration or whatever we might need down the road. And therefore, we must keep that relationship strong. And again, if it is the identity of somebody who's working with you, whose family is going to be in danger, that is absolutely true. And maybe that's still true 40 years later. It's possible that it is in certain circumstances. But
how about 61 years later?
Yeah, I mean, less and less likely.
What do you think that's about?
The assassinations of the 60s?
Yes.
Oh, I could talk to you about that all day.
I bet. You've intersected with it on various levels.
I have, yeah. And I feel something of a responsibility to get to the bottom of that, at least in my lifetime, for my children. my daughter Bobcat is Bobby the Fourth. So her great grandfather was RFK, and I want to be able to look at her and for her to know whether or not her own government was involved in these assassinations, and if so, what's been done about it to make sure that that never ever happens again, that there's never a coup like that in this country again.